I remember the sound before I remember the words. The Vox unit coughed to life with that familiar burst of static, like a throat clearing before judgment. It was half buried beneath the constant percussion of artillery, the wet crump of shells landing too close, and the distant, animal screaming of men who had already been given orders they could not survive. The signal rune on my receiver flickered amber, then red, then amber again, as if even the machine hesitated to deliver what it carried. When the voice finally cut through, it was thin, flattened by transmission and authority alike, yet utterly without doubt. Advance, that was the word. Advance immediately, no qualifiers. No mention of the fire lanes we had been mapping with our dead for 3 days straight. No acknowledgement of the way the ground ahead churned and spat bodies back at us like offerings rejected by the soil. Just advance, spoken with the same tone one might use to requisition ammunition or request a supply tally. I had been kneeling in the trench, boots sunk deep into mud that stank of rot and chemical runoff, my fingers numb around the grip of my rifle. The trench walls sweated constantly, condensation mixed with whatever fluids had soaked into the earth over weeks of bombardment. Blood, oil, excrement, it all blended into a single, sour smell that clung to the back of the throat. Above us, the sky was a low, bruised ceiling, lit intermittently by muzzle flashes and distant detonations. There was no horizon anymore, only a suggestion of direction marked by wreckage and smoke. My hands began to shake as the order repeated, slower this time, as if clarity could be achieved through volume and cadence alone. I felt it first in my fingers, then in my forearms, a tremor I tried to hide by pressing my elbows into my sides. Training told me to rise, to shout the words back down the line, to become the conduit through which the order transformed into motion. Faith told me that hesitation was sin, that doubt was weakness, that obedience was the purest form of devotion. But another part of me, quieter and long suppressed, did the arithmetic instead. I had seen the advance routes. I had watched the last wave go over, watched them turn into shapes that no longer resembled men. The enemy guns were zeroed in with mechanical patience. They did not rage or exult, they simply worked. Every meter forward cost bodies, and every body was logged somewhere, I was sure, reduced to a mark in a column that would later be reviewed and found acceptable. Necessary losses, the officers called it. Strategic expenditure, as if flesh were promethium, to be burned until the objective was met. Mud sucked greedily at my boots when I shifted my weight, as if the trench itself were trying to keep me. I could feel the eyes of the commissarial overseer somewhere behind us, unseen but omnipresent. You learned quickly that you did not need to see them for their gaze to work. It was a pressure, a heat between the shoulder blades, hotter than the muzzle flash of any enemy weapon. They watched not for bravery, but for compliance. Courage was irrelevant, obedience was everything. The order came again, sharper now, irritation creeping into the vox, distorted syllables. I opened my mouth to respond, to perform the ritual affirmation drilled into me since induction, and nothing came out. My tongue felt thick, useless, as if it no longer belonged to me. In that moment, suspended between command and action, I became acutely aware of my own breathing. The rasp of air through my rebreather sounded obscenely loud, each inhale a reminder that I was still alive, that I could still feel fear. Time stretched. I do not know how long that pause lasted, perhaps a second, perhaps less, but it was long enough for the weight of the Imperium to settle fully on my spine. Long enough for every sermon I had ever heard about duty and sacrifice to line up behind my eyes, demanding tribute. Long enough for me to understand, with a clarity that bordered on revelation, that what was being asked was not heroism. It was erasure. I thought of the recruitment halls, of the banners depicting clean uniforms and noble deaths, of the clerks who had stamped my papers without looking up. I thought of the way my name had been spoken for the last time during induction, before being replaced by a serial and a posting. I thought of how little of me had ever truly belonged to myself. And still, despite all of that, something in me resisted being spent so cheaply. The words formed before I could stop them, a single syllable, fragile and absurd in its defiance. No, it did not echo, it did not carry. It was swallowed immediately by the thunder of war, by the crack of las fire and the hull of incoming shells. Yet the moment it left my mouth, I felt a change in the air, like a pressure drop before a storm. The men nearest me froze, not turning to look, not acknowledging me in any way. They stared forward, eyes fixed on the lip of the trench, as if the world beyond it demanded their full attention. I realized then that I had already been removed from them. That refusal, however quiet, was contagious, and so I had to be isolated. The commissarial presence sharpened, becoming almost tangible. I could imagine the slow turn of a head, the narrowing of eyes behind a peaked cap. Somewhere a record was being updated, a deviation noted, a problem identified. I felt suddenly very small, a fault in a vast mechanism that did not tolerate inefficiency. The order was repeated one final time, stripped of any pretense of patience. Advance now, or be corrected. The words correction and discipline were often interchangeable in official language. I knew what they meant. I knew the examples that had been made before, the bodies left in trenches not as casualties of the enemy, but as lessons to the living. And still, my legs refused to move. In that frozen instant, before hands seized me or weapons were raised, I understood that refusal was not an act. It was a condition. I had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed, stepped out of the flow of acceptable sacrifice. Even if I rose now, even if I ran screaming into the fire as ordered, it would not erase the hesitation. The pause had been logged, if not in ink then in memory. The Imperium does not forgive inefficiency. It does not forget deviation. As the guns roared on, and the order hung in the air like a curse, I knew with absolute certainty that my fate had already been sealed. Not because I had refused, but because for the first time, I had considered doing so. When I said it, when that thin little refusal slipped out of my mouth like a cough I couldn't swallow, nothing immediate happened. There was no thunderclap of punishment, no dramatic snap of a bolt pistol, no righteous sermon shouted into my face. The war did not pause to honor my disobedience. Shells continued to fall with the same indifferent rhythm. Lasfire still stitched the murk above the parapet. Men still died in the open ground beyond, their bodies flung and shredded in ways too quick for prayer. And yet everything changed. The trench, which had been a place of constant sound, groans, shouted coordinates, the scrape of boots in mud, the wet slap of bandages, the muttered litanies of men trying to remember they were human, became strangely quiet around me. Not truly silent, the battlefield would not allow that. But the noise shifted away, as if my refusal had opened a pocket of cold air that sound refused to enter. Voices lowered, movements became careful. Even the rats seemed to stop their scurrying for a heartbeat, as if the very vermin understood that a line had been crossed. I looked at the men beside me. I expected anger. I expected pleading. I expected someone to grab my collar and shake me, to call me a fool, a coward, a traitor, to remind me that we did not get to choose. But they did not look at me at all. That was worse. Their eyes stayed fixed forward, toward the churned earth and smoke where our lives were supposed to be spent. Their faces were grey with grime and exhaustion, cheekbones sharp as bayonets. Some had dried blood under their noses from the pressure changes and constant concussive blasts. One man's lips moved silently, repeating a prayer he had likely been taught as a child, his breath fogging the inside of his rebreather mask. Another adjusted the strap on his helmet with hands that trembled in the same way mine did, though he pretended they did not. They all pretended. That was the unspoken contract. We all pretended we were brave, because admitting fear was a luxury the Commissars had burned out of us long ago. But their refusal to meet my eyes told me something vital. It told me they were not judging me as a man judges another man. They were treating me as a contamination. In the Imperium, disobedience is not merely punished, it is quarantined. It is not enough to kill the offender, you must prevent the idea from spreading. A single hesitation in a line can become a collapse. A single doubt can turn into panic. So they did what they had been conditioned to do, what was safest for them, what kept their own bodies from being reclassified as defective. They pretended I did not exist. The vox crackled again. The voice was louder now, pushed through whatever amplifiers and authority could be mustered. The order came the same, but the cadence changed, stretched out like a teacher speaking to a slow child. Advance. Now, all squads, over the top. The words were so familiar they might as well have been part of the trench itself, carved into the mud and timber. I had heard them so many times that they had stopped sounding like language and started sounding like machinery, a lever pulled, a gear turning, bodies moving. But this time they landed differently because I was no longer part of the mechanism. I was the jam in the gears. A shout ran down the trench line. Sergeants bellowing the order, voices raw and ragged. Men checked charge packs with ritual precision. Bayonets were fixed with the solemnity of altar rites. A few kissed small icons hanging from their necks, metal worn smooth by nervous fingers. The smell of cordite and promethium was thick enough to taste, coating the tongue with bitterness. Somewhere nearby, a heavy weapon team fed an ammo belt into a stubber with practiced motions, their faces blank as clerks. I remained kneeling, mud pressed cold and wet into my knees through the thin fabric of my fatigues. My boots, half sunk and half frozen in place, felt like they belonged to the trench more than to me. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, pounding too fast, too loud, as if it were trying to escape. My fingers tightened around my rifle, even though I knew I wouldn't use it. Not yet, not against the enemy, not against my own. A strange thought came to me then. Absurd in its timing, I would miss this. Not the war, not the killing, not the endless hunger and exhaustion and fear, but the trench itself, this filthy, stinking artery of survival where I had at least known the rules. In the trench, misery was communal. You suffered together. You shared water that tasted of rust. You shared rations that smelled faintly of corpse, starch and chemical preservatives. You shared jokes that weren't funny anymore because laughter was a weapon against despair. The trench was a cage, yes, but it was a cage filled with other living things. Outside the trench was open ground, where you died quickly, and beyond that, beyond refusal, was something else entirely. A deeper kind of isolation, a bureaucratic void where you could be processed, corrected, erased, and repurposed. The thought made my stomach twist. The trench, for all its horrors, was still familiar. Refusal was stepping into unknown corridors beneath the battlefield, where rules were written in ink and pain rather than shouted over gunfire. Men began to climb the trench ladders. One by one they rose, boots slipping on mud, slick rungs, hands gripping wood worn smooth by desperation. They moved like sleepwalkers, obeying not because they believed, but because disbelief was punished harder than death. I watched their backs as they went, each one becoming smaller as they reached the lip and disappeared into smoke. Some did not even make it over. A burst of fire would catch them mid-climb, and they would tumble backward into the trench, hitting the mud with a wet thud that sounded too much like dropping meat onto a cutting table. Their bodies were dragged aside without ceremony, stacked against the wall like broken equipment. No one spoke my name, no one touched me. Not yet. The commissarial gaze, burning, unseen, tightened into something sharper. I could almost hear the click of a pen on a data slate, the calm note taking of a man who saw souls as inventory. I imagined the entries: Guardsman, serial designation, failure to complied, corrective action required. My life condensed into a line of text, my refusal reduced to a clerical problem. The order came again, this time not from the Vox, but from the sergeant nearest me. He did not look at me when he spoke. His eyes stayed forward, fixed on the massacre beyond. His voice was flat, as if he were reciting from a manual. "Ope?" he said. "No," I swallowed. My mouth was dry despite the damp air. "No," I whispered again, softer than before, as if trying to make it less real. The word tasted like ash. The sergeant's jaw tightened. His nostrils flared. For a moment I thought he might strike me, might grab me, might force me up by sheer rage. But he did not. He simply turned away, as if acknowledging me would be an indulgence he couldn't afford. His silence was a sentence. That was when I truly felt it. The cold that comes when you are cut loose from the herd. The trench had become a corridor of avoidance. Men stepped around me as if I were an obstacle, not a person. Boots splashed mud onto my sleeves, but no one apologized. Someone's elbow brushed my shoulder, and he recoiled as if he had touched something diseased. Their fear was not of me, but of what standing near me might imply. Proximity to disobedience could be interpreted as sympathy. Sympathy could be interpreted as sedition. Sedition was a word that ended with a bullet or worse. Even the prayers broadcast over the cracked trench Speakers seemed to shift tone, the static-laced hymns suddenly sounding like condemnation. Obedience is love, the voice intoned. Love is survival, survival is service, service is obedience. The loop repeated endlessly, a doctrinal circuit designed to wear grooves into the mind. The silence around me deepened until it felt like pressure, like the weight of a coffin lid being lowered. I realized then that refusal was not loud, it was not heroic, it was not the dramatic rebellion the propaganda feeds warned about. Refusal was small and quiet and completely, utterly alone. The war roared on, indifferent. Men continued to climb, to die, to be replaced. The trench continued to stink and sweat and swallow the fallen. Somewhere down the line, a commissar began to move, not running, not hurried, but with the steady pace of someone who knows time is on his side. Authority always has time. It can afford patience. It can afford inevitability. I stayed kneeling in the mud, the word, no, still hanging in the air like a curse that only I could hear. The silence that followed was colder than any void, because it was not empty. It was filled with meaning, the meaning of being marked. They did not announce themselves when they came for me. Authority in the Imperium rarely does. It does not need ceremony, it relies on inevitability. One moment I was still kneeling in the trench, numb with cold and isolation, and the next rough hands closed around my arms, fingers digging into muscle and webbing with practiced efficiency. There was no anger in their grip, no hesitation. I was not being arrested as a man, I was being collected as an object. My rifle was taken first. It was lifted from my hands with the same carelessness one might use when removing a damaged tool from a workbench. I felt its absence immediately, not because I intended to use it, but because it had been one of the last things that still connected me to the role I had been trained for. Without it, I was no longer a guardsman in the eyes of the Imperium. I was a problem to be processed. They hauled me to my feet, boots tearing free from the mud with a sucking sound that felt obscene, like something being pulled from a wound. Pain flared in my knees, sharp and sudden, but no one slowed. I was dragged down the trench, past men who would not look at me, past blood, slick walls reinforced with timber scavenged from ruined hab blocks. The trench seemed narrower now, its ceiling lower, the air heavier. Each step echoed with the unspoken understanding that this was the last time I would walk it as one of them. We passed the wounded first. They lay on stretchers or directly in the mud, where Medicae units had not deemed them worth immediate retrieval. Some clutched at passing legs, fingers weak and trembling, begging for water or a stim, injector, or simply for someone to acknowledge that they were still alive. Their voices were hoarse, shredded by smoke and pain. One man had no lower jaw, only a ragged ruin of flesh and teeth, his pleas emerging as wet gurgles that haunted me long after we passed him. Servitors moved among them with mechanical indifference, limbs wearing softly, red optics flicking from one body to the next. They administered aid according to parameters I could not see, injecting some, ignoring others. Efficiency dictated mercy. Those who fell outside acceptable recovery margins were logged and left. Watching them, I wondered which category I now belonged to. Damaged but functional, defective but potentially useful. I did not know whether to hope they would ignore me as well. No charges were rid as we moved. No one spoke my name. In fact, no one spoke at all, save for the occasional barked instruction to clear a path or open a hatch. Somewhere behind us, the battle continued its relentless rhythm, but with each step downward it became more distant, muffled by layers of earth and ferrocrete. The trench gave way to a reinforced access tunnel, its walls sweating with condensation and streaked with rust. Lumen strips flickered overhead, bathing everything in a sickly yellow light that made skin look jaundiced and corpse-like. An officer walked ahead of us, his boots clean despite the conditions, his coat trimmed and pressed. He did not turn to look at me. Instead, he held a data slate in one gloved hand, his thumb moving with small, precise gestures as he entered information. I caught a glimpse of the screen once, long enough to see rows of text and numeric codes scrolling past. Somewhere in that lattice of data was me, reduced to a designation and a note of non-compliance. I realized then that my refusal had already been translated. The emotion, the fear, the moral weight of the moment, all of it had been stripped away and converted into something the system could understand. A deviation. A fault. A resource requiring reassignment. We descended deeper, leaving the sounds of open warfare behind. The corridors beneath the battlefield were narrow and damp, their ceilings low enough that I had to duck in places. Pipes ran along the walls, some hissing softly, others leaking fluids that pooled on the floor in iridescent slicks. The air smelled of mildew, oil, and something faintly sweet that I later realized was decay. Every footstep echoed too loudly, magnified by the enclosed space, as if the tunnels themselves were listening. Screams carried through the corridors, sudden and sharp, then cut off just as abruptly. They echoed strangely, distorted by distance and architecture, making it impossible to tell how close they were. Some sounded human, others less so, stretched and broken by pain or augmentation. No one reacted to them. They were part of the background noise, like the hum of generators or the drip of water from cracked pipes. I wondered if I would add my voice to that chorus. The grip on my arms tightened as we passed a sealed door, marked with warning sigils and faded devotional text. I could not read all of it, but I recognized enough to know it was a place of correction, not judgment. Judgment implied deliberation. Correction implied procedure. The difference mattered more than I had ever been taught. At one point, we passed a small alcove where a shrine had been erected, candles guttering in the damp air, a crude icon bolted to the wall. A servitor knelt before it, motionless, incense burners clutched in skeletal hands. Its augmetic eyes glowed faintly as it intoned prayers in a flat, uninflected voice, repeating litanies about obedience and sacrifice. The words followed us down the corridor, echoing in my head like a refrain. Refusal does not end service. The thought came unbidden, settling heavily in my chest. I had believed in some foolish corner of my mind that saying no would end things cleanly. A bullet, perhaps, a shallow grave, an end to fear. But the Imperium did not waste assets so simply. It reshaped them. It found new ways to extract value. We stopped before another door, larger than the others, its surface scarred by age and use. Sigils marked its edges, some scratched out and replaced, layers of authority built atop one another like sediment. The officer finally turned then, his eyes flicking to me for the first time. They were pale and unreadable, devoid of curiosity or malice. To him, I was already resolved. He tapped his data slate once, decisively. A chime sounded. Somewhere inside the mechanism of the door, locks disengaged with a series of heavy clicks. Transfer complete, he said, not to me, but to the record. Then he turned away, already moving on to the next task. The hands on my arms shoved me forward. The door opened, releasing a rush of colder air that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old blood. As I crossed the threshold, the sounds of the battlefield faded entirely, replaced by the low hum of machinery and distant, rhythmic chanting. The door closed behind me with a finality that resonated in my bones. In that moment, standing in the dim light of a place not meant for men who still had choices, I understood the truth of my situation fully. Refusal had not freed me. It had merely redirected me. My service was not over. It had simply been reclassified. The cell they put me in was not meant to be stood in. That was the first thing I understood when the door sealed shut behind me with a sound like a coffin being nailed closed. It was a vertical drawer of metal and stone, barely wider than my shoulders, barely deep enough to turn my head. The walls were slick with condensation and old residue, streaked with stains that had long since lost their original color. Some were dark and rusted, others pale and chalky, layered one atop another like a history written in fluids. The floor was cold ferrocrete, uneven beneath my boots. A shallow channel ran down the center, clogged with debris and filth, carrying waste away at a pace too slow to ever truly clean it. The smell hit me a moment later, old blood, human waste, chemical disinfectant applied long after usefulness had passed. It filled my lungs and settled there, heavy and cloying, impossible to escape. I gagged once, then swallowed it back. There was nowhere for weakness to go in a space this small. The light came from a single lumen strip embedded in the ceiling, its casing cracked, its glow constant and merciless. It did not flicker. It did not dim. There would be no night here, no rest measured by darkness. Time would be counted in heartbeats, in breaths, in the slow erosion of thought. I had heard stories about places like this, whispered between guardsmen during rare moments of quiet. But hearing and experiencing were different things entirely. Stories still allowed distance. The cell allowed none. I leaned back against the wall out of instinct, then hissed as something sharp bit into my shoulder blade. Metal protrusions jutted from the surface at irregular intervals, old hooks, broken restraints, fragments of devices no longer in use. I wondered how many bodies had been held here before me, pressed into the same angles, bleeding into the same cracks. The Imperium reused everything. Space was no exception. A voice crackled to life overhead, distorted and thin, carried through speakers I could not see. It began with prayer. Blessed is the obedient mind. It intoned, the words slurred slightly by age and interference. For it shall not know doubt. Blessed is the compliant flesh, for it shall be spared correction. Obedience is love. Love is survival. The litany looped over and over, each repetition identical to the last. There was no pause between cycles, no allowance for reflection. It was not meant to inspire. It was meant to grind. The words seeped into the skull through repetition alone, like water wearing down stone. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sound vibrated through the walls, through my bones. There was no muting it. Somewhere nearby, someone screamed. It was sudden, raw, tearing itself out of a throat already pushed beyond endurance. The sound reverberated through the cell block, bouncing off metal and stone, folding back on itself until it was impossible to tell where it came from. The scream ended abruptly, cut off in a way that suggested not mercy, but interruption. Machinery continued to hum. The prayer continued to play. Nothing acknowledged the sound had occurred. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, knees pulled awkwardly toward my chest. The space did not allow comfort. Every position became painful after a few minutes, muscles cramping, joints protesting. The body, I realized, was being reminded of its limits, of its dependence, of how easily it could be broken down into manageable components. At first, I tried to keep track of time. I counted repetitions of the prayer, breaths between screams, the cycles of distant footsteps passing the cell. But the lumen never changed, and the prayers never stopped, and eventually the counts blurred together. My mouth grew dry, my stomach cramped with hunger, no water was given, no rations. I wondered if this was oversight or intent, and quickly understood the answer was irrelevant. Deprivation was always intentional in places like this, even when it wasn't. Whispers began after a while. They came through the walls, faint at first, barely distinguishable from the hum of machinery. A murmur here, a word there, voices filtered through layers of stone and fear. I pressed my ear against the cold surface and listened. Didn't mean to. One voice said, cracking with exhaustion, "Just a second too slow." Another whispered, followed by a quiet sob. Some voices prayed, some begged. Some confessed crimes I suspected they had not committed, listing sins in the desperate hope that guilt might be easier to process than randomness. One voice laughed softly, over and over, until it dissolved into coughing. Another voice repeated a name, perhaps their own, perhaps someone else's, until it lost all meaning and became just a sound. We did not speak to one another directly. No one asked questions. No one offered comfort. We were close enough to hear each other breathe, yet utterly alone. That, I understood, was the point. Solidarity breeds resistance. Isolation breeds compliance. The prayers continued to seep into my thoughts, worming their way into the spaces left by exhaustion and hunger. Obedience is love. Love is survival. Survival is service. Service is obedience. The loop was perfect, closed, inescapable. I found myself repeating fragments of it under my breath without realizing I was doing so, my tongue moving automatically, as if reciting doctrine might somehow anchor me. It did not. Instead, my thoughts turned inward, circling the moment in the trench over and over like a wound I couldn't stop probing. The pause. The word. The silence that followed. I asked myself the same questions repeatedly, each time with less certainty. Why did I believe my life was worth more than the order? Where had that belief come from? Had it been arrogance, cowardice disguised as morality, or had it been the last remnant of something human that the Imperium had failed to burn out of me? The cell did not answer. The prayers did not answer. The screams did not answer. At some point, I cannot say when, the door opened. Light spilled in from the corridor, slightly different in tone from the lumen above, casting sharp shadows that hurt my eyes. A figure stood there, partially obscured, their outline blurred by my tears and fatigue. They did not enter. They did not speak. They simply looked at me, head tilted slightly, as if assessing an object for damage. A data slate chimed softly. Subject awake. A voice said, bored, responsive, transfer pending. The door closed again. I do not know why that moment frightened me more than the screams. Perhaps because it confirmed that this was not punishment. It was preparation. The holding cell was not an end. It was a waiting place where resistance could soften, where identity could erode just enough to make the next step easier. I curled in on myself as best I could, pressing my forehead against my knees. My skin felt tight and filthy. My thoughts felt sluggish, as if wrapped in cotton. Somewhere deep inside, fear gave way to something duller and heavier: inevitability. The understanding that whatever came next had already been decided, logged, approved. The prayers droned on, the lumen burned, the cell held, and slowly, relentlessly, I felt myself being emptied out, made ready for whatever shape the Imperium intended to pour me into next. They came for me without warning, which by then I understood was the only warning I would ever receive again. The door to the holding cell opened with a hydraulic sigh, releasing air that smelled cleaner than what I had been breathing, though only barely. Hands reached in, gloved, efficient, and hauled me upright before my legs could remember how to function. Pain shot up my calves and into my hips, white and immediate, but there was no pause to let it settle. I was dragged forward, out of the drawer that had been my entire world, and into the corridor beyond. The prayers cut off the moment the door sealed behind us. The sudden absence of sound was disorienting, like stepping into vacuum. For a few seconds there was only the scrape of my boots on the floor, and the steady hum of distant machinery. Then new sounds layered in: chanting, low and rhythmic, the whine of power tools, the faint crackle of electrical discharge. Each noise carried intent, each promised purpose. The chamber they brought me to was wider than the cell, but somehow more suffocating. Its walls were clad in metal panels engraved with devotional text and sigils of authority, many of them worn smooth by touch or scarred by heat. Incense burned in wall-mounted censers, filling the air with a thick, cloying sweetness that barely masked the underlying smell of burning insulation and old blood. The scents mixed poorly, creating something nauseating and sacred all at once. I was seated in a chair bolted directly to the floor. Restraints snapped closed around my wrists, ankles, and chest, biting into skin and bone with calibrated pressure. The metal was cold, shockingly so, and I gasped as it leached warmth from me. Somewhere inside the chair, something hummed to life, vibrating faintly against my spine. I suspected it was not there for comfort. Across from me stood a desk of dark plasteel, its surface immaculate. A figure in robes occupied the space behind it, face partially obscured by a hood and the shadow cast by a lumen globe hanging low overhead. They did not look like a soldier. They did not look like a priest, either. They were something in between, a functionary of discipline, dressed in layers of authority and ritual. A data slate rested on the desk. It chimed softly as it activated. Begin record, the figure said, voice calm, precise, not unkind. That frightened me more than shouting ever could have. A small lens extended from the wall beside me, its red indicator blinking to life. I realized then that this was not a conversation, it was documentation. Whatever I said would be preserved, indexed, and filed somewhere far from me, to be reviewed by eyes that would never see my face. State your designation, the figure said. I opened my mouth, then hesitated. My name felt distant, unreal, like something belonging to another person. I gave it anyway, along with my serial number, my unit, my posting. The words came out hoarse, scraped raw by D'Souza. The figure nodded, making a small mark on the data slate. State the nature of your non-compliance. There it was, reduced to a phrase. I swallowed. I refused an order, I said. Clarify. The figure prompted. I was ordered to advance. I continued. I did not. Why? The question was simple, too simple. I searched for an answer that would make sense within the rigid framework of doctrine, something that could be logged and categorized. It was pointless, I said finally. We were being sent to die for nothing. The figure's pen paused. Pointless, they repeated, tasting the word. Explain. I tried. I spoke of firing lines and overlapping fields of fire, of bodies used to measure distance, of orders issued from positions too far removed to smell the blood. I spoke of arithmetic masquerading as strategy. As I talked, I became aware of subtle changes in the chair beneath me, tiny shifts in vibration, in pressure. When my voice grew more confident, the restraints tightened imperceptibly. When I faltered, a faint electrical tingle ran along my spine, not painful, but threatening. "Your assessment is noted," the figure said when I finished. "However, your reasoning deviates from approved doctrinal interpretation." "I know," I whispered. "Do you?" The figure tilted their head slightly. "Because the record suggests uncertainty." The chair pulsed. Pain bloomed suddenly, sharp and intimate, threading through my nerves with surgical precision. It was not overwhelming. It was worse than that. It was measured, controlled, applied with the care of someone who knew exactly how much was required to elicit reaction without causing damage that would reduce utility. I cried out despite myself, teeth clenching hard enough that my jaw ached. "Record subject response," the figure said calmly. The pain cut off as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a buzzing H and the humiliating awareness of my own ragged breathing. Sweat beaded on my skin, cold in the incense, thick air. "Repeat your explanation," the figure said. I did, but this time the words came out less certain. Doubt crept in uninvited. Was it pointless, or had I simply been afraid? Had I misjudged? The chair hummed softly as if listening. "Better," the figure murmured, making another mark. "Now, tell me, do you believe your life holds greater value than the objective you were assigned?" The question hit harder than the pain. I stared at the hooded face, searching for some hint of expectation. None came. "I don't know," I said. The chair pulsed again, gentler this time, as if in approval. "Uncertainty acknowledged," the figure said. Proceeding, the questioning went on for hours, or perhaps minutes. Time fractured under the weight of pain and exhaustion. Each answer I gave was dissected, weighed, and compared against doctrine. When my responses aligned too closely with self-preservation, the pain increased. When I expressed doubt, confusion, or a desire to understand rather than resist, it lessened. Patterns emerged. Lessons were taught without being spoken aloud. I began to doubt my own memory of the trench, the pause, the word. Had I truly refused? Or had I merely hesitated as anyone might? Was the difference even real? The figure suggested alternatives gently, planting questions rather than accusations. "Could it be," they said at one point, "that your perception was flawed due to stress? That your recollection is unreliable?" I nodded, tears streaking down my face, unsure when I had started crying. The pain had done its work. Clarity, I realized, was not the same as truth. Clarity was alignment. By the end, my throat was raw, my body trembling with fatigue and residual shock. I no longer begged to be released. I begged to understand. To know what the correct answer was. To be told how to think so that the pain would stop. The figure stood, gathering their data slate. "Record complete," they said. "Subject demonstrates capacity for recalibration." The restraints released with a series of clicks, and I slumped forward, barely caught by hands that had been waiting for the moment. As they dragged me from the chair, I caught a final glimpse of the data slate screen. Lines of text scrolled past, neat and orderly, my life reduced to a record. As I was hauled away, the last thing I heard was the figure's voice, speaking not to me, but to the archive. Recommendation reassignment. Continued service viable. I did not feel relief. I felt hollow. They did not bring me to a courtroom, I think. Somewhere deep inside, a foolish fragment of me still expected one. Some chamber where words would be weighed, where guilt would be declared aloud, where the shape of my punishment would at least be named before it descended. That fragment died the moment I was pushed into a narrow administrative chamber that smelled of dust, ink, and old parchment sealed beneath layers of plasteel. Judgment in the Imperium does not require spectacle. It requires paperwork. I was forced to stand before a metal desk scarred by centuries of use. Its edges were worn smooth where countless hands had rested, signed, stamped, and passed sentences along. A single lumen hung overhead, casting harsh light that flattened everything it touched. Behind the desk sat a clerk priest in layered robes, their face hidden behind a rebreather mask and ocular lenses that glowed faintly as they scanned data only they could see. To one side stood 2 armed enforcers, weapons held at rest, but angled just enough to remind me that rest was conditional. A data slate was slid across the desk toward me. Sentence. The clerk, priest said, voice filtered and emotionless. That was all. I stared at the slate. The text was dense, written in the clipped, reverent language of imperial bureaucracy. I recognized fragments, designations, references to doctrinal statutes, cross-indexed approvals, but most of it blurred together. My eyes kept snagging on a single phrase, repeated more than once, continued service. There was no execution date. The absence of it felt heavier than any death sentence could have. Execution was clean, definitive. It ended things. Continued service was an open wound, a future stretched thin and sharp, designed to extract every remaining measure of usefulness before discarding the husk. Reassignment pending. The clerk, priest continued. Classification inefficient obedience. Corrective utilization authorized. I wanted to ask what that meant. I wanted to ask where I was being sent, what I would become, whether there was any part of me left that still mattered. The words lodged in my throat and refused to surface. The interrogation had taught me that questions were dangerous. Questions implied a desire for agency. I said nothing. A servo arm descended from the ceiling with a mechanical whine, ending in a heavy, ink-stained stamp. It hovered over the data slate for a moment, as if savoring the act, then came down hard. The sound echoed through the chamber, loud and final. Judgment rendered. They did not allow me to linger. Hands seized my arms again, hauling me away from the desk before I could read another word. The clerk priest was already turning to the next slate, the next life, the next minor deviation to be processed. I was forgotten in the same moment I was condemned. The processing began immediately. They shaved me first. Not just my head, but every inch of hair from my body, scraped away with buzzing tools that bit too close to the skin. Clumps fell to the floor, dark and lifeless, swept away without comment. Then came the washing, high-pressure jets of chemically treated water that scalded and froze in alternating bursts, stripping away grime, oils and any lingering sense of dignity. My skin burned and cracked under the assault, raw and hypersensitive. I screamed once when a jet hit an open sore left behind by the restraints. No one reacted. I was scrubbed with stiff brushes by servitors whose hands were too strong and too precise. They worked until my skin bled, until I felt flayed rather than cleaned. The pain was sharp and honest, lacking the calculated subtlety of interrogation. This was preparation, not persuasion. When they were finished, I was left shivering on a metal slab, my body marked with new bruises and raw patches that stung with every breath. A priest approached then, their robes immaculate, their voice low and almost gentle. "You are fortunate," they said, as if offering comfort. "The Imperium does not discard resources without first exhausting their potential." I did not feel fortunate. Restraints were fitted next. Not the crude cuffs of a prisoner, but something more elaborate. Bands of metal were locked around my wrists, my ankles, my neck. They tightened with a series of precise clicks, settling into place with a pressure that was constant and unyielding. Each restraint bore engraved script, litanies of obedience etched so finely they bit into the skin. I could feel them there, even when I closed my eyes, a reminder that I was owned down to the marrow. When I shifted, even slightly, the bands responded with a faint vibration, a warning hum that promised escalation if I continued. Correction built into the very act of movement. They measured me after that. I was catalogued the way one might catalogue livestock or machinery. Height, weight, bone density, muscle mass. Scans were run, needles inserted, samples taken. My blood was drawn and analyzed, my eyes examined, my reflexes tested with sharp prods and sudden flashes of light. Each result was logged, compared against baseline expectations, annotated with notes about deficiencies and compensatory options. I was not asked how I felt. At one point, a pair of adepts discussed me openly while I stood there restrained, their voices clinical and detached. "Cognitive resistance remains," one said, "but malleable. Pain thresholds acceptable," the other replied. "Augmentation tolerance likely high." They spoke as if I were not present, as if my awareness were irrelevant. Perhaps it was. The priests returned when the measurements were complete. One of them placed a hand on my shoulder, fingers cool and steady. "Redemption," They said softly, as achieved through utility, "You have been found wanting in one form. You will be corrected and made useful in another." I wanted to tell them that I did not seek redemption, that I did not believe myself sinful for hesitating. But the words felt childish now, like something from a past life that no longer applied. The Imperium did not care about belief. It cared about output. They marched me through corridors I had not seen before, cleaner and more brightly lit than the holding cells, but somehow more terrifying. These were not places of neglect. They were places of intent. I passed doors marked with sigils indicating specialized functions: compliance conditioning, neural calibration, combat augmentation. Each one hummed with restrained power. We stopped before a final door larger than the rest. As it opened, a wave of cold air washed over me, carrying the sterile scent of antiseptic and machine oil. Inside, I glimpsed metal frames, articulated arms, and tools arranged with ritual precision. My knees weakened. The priest leaned close, their voice barely above a whisper. "Do not fear," they said. "Fear indicates attachment. Attachment is inefficient." They guided me forward, as the door closed behind me, sealing off whatever remnants of my former life still lingered outside. I understood the true nature of my sentence. This was not punishment. This was optimization. I was being reduced, refined, and reshaped into something that would never pause at an order again. In the Imperium, mercy is wasteful, and I was no longer allowed to be wasted. They returned me to the war, but the man who had once knelt in the trench did not come back with me. Whatever survived the chambers of correction, whatever endured the cutting tables and calibration rites, was something altered, something measured and tightened until it fit the Imperium's needs precisely. I remember the moment the implants activated. There was no ceremony, no countdown, just a sudden, blinding pressure behind my eyes, as if a spike had been driven straight through my skull and twisted for purchase. Light exploded across my vision in fractured runes and warning sigils, red and amber glyphs burning themselves into my thoughts. I screamed, or tried to. The sound came out wrong, strangled by a voice modulator I hadn't known they'd installed. When the pain receded, it did not vanish. It settled. It became a constant, low thrum, like a machine idling just beneath my consciousness. Commands followed, not spoken aloud, not transmitted through Vox. They arrived fully formed inside my head, layered atop my own thoughts with brutal intimacy. Advance vector, target priority, compliance check. Each instruction carried a weight, a pressure that made ignoring it unthinkable. When I tried, out of reflex, out of memory, the pressure spiked sharply, sending a lance of agony down my spine that stole breath and reason alike. Obedience was no longer a choice. It was a physiological response. They marched us out in ranks, boots striking ferrocrete in perfect unison. I was not alone. Others walked beside me, men and women whose eyes had the same distant glaze, whose movements were just a fraction too synchronized to be natural. We did not speak. We did not need to. The implants ensured cohesion more effectively than any shouted order ever could. The battlefield greeted us with the same smells as before: burned promethium, churned earth, the copper tang of blood, but I perceived them differently now. Sensory filters dulled some inputs and sharpened others. Threat vectors glowed faintly at the edges of my vision. Enemy positions resolved themselves into pulsing outlines, each tagged with kill probabilities and ammunition recommendations. The chaos of war was flattened into data. I recognized the ground. This was the same front, the same killing field I had refused to cross. My legs moved without hesitation. Each step forward tore at something buried deep inside me. A memory of resistance, a fragment of self that screamed silently as my body obeyed without question. The implants responded to that internal conflict instantly, flooding my nerves with corrective feedback. Pain flared hot and precise, extinguishing the thought before it could fully form. I learned quickly. I fired when told. The recoil felt distant, filtered. Targets fell in neat succession, each confirmed kill acknowledged by a soft chime in my skull. I advanced when ordered, even when the ground erupted around me, even when men beside me were reduced to fragments by artillery. The fear was still there, somewhere, but it was smothered beneath layers of enforced discipline. Panic required time. I was not given any. Once, only once, I saw a figure ahead stumble and fall, caught in open ground. He reached out toward us, mouth open in a plea I could not hear over the gunfire. For a fraction of a second, something old and stubborn stirred in me, a memory of the trench, of silence, of choice. The implants detected the deviation. Agony slammed through me, blinding and absolute. My vision whited out. I dropped to one knee, convulsing, muscles locking as corrective impulses surged. The command overrode everything else. Eliminate target, continue advance. When my sight cleared, my weapon was already raised, my finger already pulling the trigger. The body stopped moving. We were efficient, horribly so. Where once waves of guardsmen had been thrown forward to measure enemy fire, now units like ours carved narrow, lethal paths through resistance. Losses were lower, ammunition expenditure was optimized, the data would look good in reports. Somewhere, an officer would nod in satisfaction at the improved ratios. At night, if it could still be called night under the perpetual glow of bombardment, the implants did not fully disengage. They dimmed, reducing active command input, but the pressure remained, a watchful presence that ensured rest never strayed into dreams too dangerous to allow. When I closed my eyes, I saw runes and firing arcs instead of faces. When I slept, I dreamed of marching. Maintenance cycles were conducted regularly. We were lined up, inspected, recalibrated. Tech priests muttered binaric prayers as they adjusted parameters, tightening thresholds, smoothing response curves. When one of us failed to meet standards, when reaction times slipped or compliance indicators flickered, we were taken aside and returned later, quieter than before. Sometimes they did not return at all. I stopped wondering what happened to them. The pain became familiar. I learned its gradients, its warnings. A low hum meant minor deviation. A sharp spike meant immediate correction. Full overload was something I only experienced once, early on, when exhaustion caused a delay between command and action. I woke hours later in a recovery cradle, throat raw from screaming, muscles trembling with residual shock. A note had been added to my file. Tolerance adjusted. I did not make that mistake again. What remained of my original self grew smaller each day, compressed beneath layers of enforced behavior. Thoughts that once would have lingered, questions, doubts, memories, were now intercepted and dissolved before they could fully form. The Imperium had not removed my will entirely. It had simply surrounded it with pain, making its exercise prohibitively expensive. This, I realized, was the true lesson. Not that refusal was impossible, but that it was unsustainable. As the campaign ground on, as objectives were taken and abandoned and retaken in endless cycles, I became something the officers relied upon. A dependable asset. A unit that did not falter. They did not praise us. Praise implied personhood. They simply redeployed us where resistance was thickest, where hesitation would cost too much. I felt pride once, dim and distorted, when a commendation was logged under my designation. Not for bravery, for efficiency. It sickened me afterward, in rare moments. Usually during transport, when the implant's vigilance slackened just enough, I could feel the shape of the man I had been, pressed thin and silent beneath layers of code and pain. He did not speak anymore. He only watched, trapped behind my eyes, as my body marched and killed and complied. Refusal had not saved me. It had taught the Imperium exactly how to ensure I would never do it again. I do not know why I am allowed to record this. That thought returns to me often, surfacing during the rare intervals when the implants loosen their grip just enough for something like reflection to occur. Perhaps it is intentional. Perhaps the Imperium believes there is value even in confession, so long as it is contained, archived, and stripped of consequence. Or perhaps this is simply another test, another way to see what remains when everything useful has already been taken. This record will not be heard by those who need it. I understand that now. It will be sealed behind layers of classification, indexed under corrective outcomes and compliance optimization, referenced only by clerks and adepts who will never know my face. If it is ever accessed again, it will be as data, not as a voice. Still, I speak. My body no longer feels like it belongs to me. Augmetics ache where flesh once was. Interfaces pressing against nerve clusters that were never meant to host them. Some of the pain is constant, a background reminder of ownership. Other pains come in sharp, instructive bursts when my thoughts wander too close to forbidden territory. The implants are patient but thorough. They do not sleep, Neither, truly, do I. Scars map my skin in patterns I do not remember earning. Surgical seams intersect with shrapnel wounds. Devotional script etched into metal plates fused to bone. When I run my fingers over them during maintenance downtime, an indulgence I am sometimes permitted, I feel less like a man tracing his history and more like a machine inspecting stress fractures. I am tired in ways sleep does not fix. The war continues. It always does. Fronts shift, enemies change, objectives are redefined and then quietly abandoned, but the need for bodies remains constant. For assets. For compliant units that do not pause at the edge of trenches or calculate the cost of obedience. I am deployed wherever hesitation would be inconvenient. Breach zones, suppression corridors, attrition fields where survival is measured in minutes. I survive more often than not. That, I have learned, is not mercy. It is proof of function. Sometimes I see new recruits arrive at the front, fresh faces beneath helmets too clean, eyes still capable of widening at the sound of incoming fire. They remind me painfully of who I was, though the memory feels like it belongs to another lifetime. I watch them absorb doctrine in hurried briefings, see belief and fear wrestling behind their expressions. I wonder which of them will hesitate first. Which of them will pause for a heartbeat too long and feel the weight of the Imperium settle on their spine? I never warn them. Not because I cannot, but because I know it would change nothing. The system does not require ignorance to function. It survives awareness just as easily. Even if one of them heard me, truly heard me, what would they do? Run, refuse, die quickly instead of slowly. The outcome would be logged all the same. The Imperium does not need silence. It needs inevitability. On rare occasions, during administrative reviews or doctrinal demonstrations, my case is referenced indirectly. I have overheard adepts discussing refusal incidents and successful corrective redeployment. My designation appears in those discussions, stripped of context, reduced to a data point illustrating improved compliance outcomes through neural enforcement. I am an example now, a proof. I suppose that is why this confession is permitted. It completes the lesson. I no longer dream of the trench. That image has faded, overwritten by newer memories of advancement and fire. But sometimes when the implants cycle down and the pain recedes to a manageable hum, I remember the silence that followed my refusal. The way the men would not look at me. The way the world seemed to narrow to a single, dangerous choice. That moment was the last time my fate felt like my own. If this record is ever reviewed by someone with the authority to feel curiosity, let them note this. Refusal in the Imperium is not rebellion, it is not heroism, it is not even truly resistance, it is inefficiency, a flaw in output, a momentary malfunction in a vast apparatus that has no patience for variance. Malfunctions are corrected. I was not executed because execution would have been wasteful. I was not imprisoned indefinitely because confinement produces nothing. I was not forgiven because forgiveness implies error on the part of authority. Instead, I was repurposed, rewired, returned to the line as something more reliable than the man who once knelt in the mud and said no. If another guardsman hesitates somewhere, if another voice falters at the edge of an order and wonders whether there is space for mercy or reason, this record will not reach them. But even if it did, I doubt it would help. The Imperium does not argue, it does not persuade, it demonstrates. I am that demonstration. My voice will end here, sealed into the archive, catalogued and forgotten. My body will continue until it fails, at which point it will be stripped for parts or reassigned to a function requiring fewer cognitive remnants. Either way, the lesson will persist, preserved far more effectively than any warning ever could be. The order always wins, even when you think, for a single heartbeat, that you have not followed it.